Chapter 22. Harry Potter shouted, "Three!" The plaque on the wall exploded outward with such force that it knocked Harry, Neville, and Luna flat on their backs. Their wands flew out of their hands. "Look," said Headmistress McGonagall excitedly before they had a chance to recover. "There's a hole behind the plaque." As Harry looked up, a puff of dust drifted out of the hole. "Hello?" came a small voice from inside the wall. "Is anybody there?" "Holly?" called out Harry wonderingly, getting to his knees. "Is that you?" "Dad!" wheezed another small voice. "You're alive!" the voice said joyfully. "Albus?" "They're alive!" Harry shouted to the others. Relief washed over him like a tidal wave. "Hurry!" spoke Holly urgently. "Get us out of here!" Harry, Luna, and Neville scrambled to their feet. All four wizards, McGonagall included, eagerly examined the tiny heart-shaped hole that still had dust pouring out. "Careful," said Neville, studying the hole again after he had retrieved his wand. "We don't want to risk pushing the stones backwards." Using their wands, they enlarged the hole brick by brick, severing each brick from its mortar and then removing it. The whole time they could hear the other stones crashing from within, making their task all the more urgent. Finally, the opening was large enough for Luna to reach through and bring out one of the children. "Take Albus first," insisted Holly. "He has some broken ribs." Over Albus's protests, he was pulled through the hole. Harry reached out and took him from Luna. Albus clung to Harry, sobbing in his ear the whole time. "You're alive! You're alive!" he kept saying. Luna pulled out Holly next. As Holly's legs were being dragged through the hole, a loud rumble sounded. Huge blocks of stone fell behind the opening, landing where Holly and Albus had been moments earlier. When the dust cleared, the opening the wizards had created remained. But beyond, through the opening, Harry could only see the interior of the study hall on the other side of the trophy room. The enclosure, which had held Holly and Albus, had vanished. "Are they okay?" asked McGonagall worriedly. Harry Potter looked intently at Holly and Albus. Both children were pale and dirty. They each had dark circles under their eyes, betraying lack of sleep. Albus had numerous bloody cuts on his face and hands, and a huge gash that sliced through his cheek. Holly's robes looked like it had been slashed to ribbons. She had several cuts, too, and a large lump on her forehead. Though serious, all of it could be put right easily after a visit to Madame Pomfrey. "They seem to be," he said to McGonagall. McGonagall pointed her wand at the door. From its tip came a silver cat with spectacle markings around its eyes. The cat raced out the door, filling the hallway with a silvery light as it moved. "That will let Professor Iverson and the Hufflepuffs know that Miss Wycliffe has been located," she stated. "Professor Longbottom, would you be so good as to inform Mr. James Potter, Miss Weasley, and Mr. O'Daniels that young Mr. Potter has been found safely as well? No doubt they've been worrying." Neville nodded. "Afterwards, please join us in the infirmary, as I am sure you would like to hear more about tonight's experiences." "I'll let Mrs. Figg know, too," Neville added as he left the room. While still regarding the children with wonder and relief, Harry spoke to McGonagall softly. "With your permission," he began, "I think we'd better get them up to the infirmary to be checked out." He shifted Albus to a more comfortable position in his arms. McGonagall nodded. "I'll meet you there shortly. I still have this room to seal up. I trust you won't be trying to make another unauthorized entrance tonight." "No," agreed Harry faintly, while staring at the hole in the wall where the plaque had once been. "I won't." He turned, carrying Albus, and headed out the door. Luna, with Holly still in her arms, followed. "Your robe looks shredded," commented Luna serenely to Holly as they walked. "Did the Ringle splints do that?" Luna's butterfly clips had shifted position again, and one had latched onto Holly's hair, pulling it back and out of Holly's face. "No," replied Holly softly. "I expect it was the exploding mirror that did it. But it wasn't in all that great of a condition before." "Exploding mirror?" thought Harry. That explained the cuts and the scratches, but not the broken ribs. nor did it explain why Albus had seemed so relieved to see him alive. Harry longed to ask more questions, but decided it would have to wait. He didn't want to make the children explain things twice. They walked up to the infirmary in silence. "I suppose you should let Ginny know her services will no longer be necessary," commented Luna calmly as they walked. Yes, you're right, I should," replied Harry. He had forgotten all about Ginny in his relief to find the children alive. "Creature!" he called out. There was a loud crack, and the familiar house elf was instantly at his side. Holly looked silently down at Creature with very wide eyes. "Yes, sir, Master Harry?" Creature looked up at Harry. "Oh, you found them, sir. Very good." Creature's huge ears flapped up and down excitedly. "Were they where you thought?" "Yes, Creature," said Harry. "Has Ginny arrived yet?" "Yes, sir, Master Harry," replied Creature. "She is in Headmistress McGonagall's office waiting. She didn't know whether she should join you in the trophy room or not." "Would you please let her know that the children have been found and are being taken to the infirmary?" Creature nodded. "Oh, and please thank all the house elves for their help in looking for them." "Yes, sir," replied Creature cheerfully. With another loud crack, he vanished. "So that's what a house elf looks like!" exclaimed Holly after Creature had left. "I've been wondering about that for ever so long a time." Harry looked at Holly thoughtfully as they continued walking. "It's very late," he began. "I know your mother has a health stone, but I don't know if they noticed anything wrong. I wouldn't want to disturb them unnecessarily at this hour." Holly nodded silently as they continued up the steps. She wanted very much to be with her parents too, but didn't know if she should wake them up, only to worry them after the fact. They had reached the top of the steps when a third loud crack announced the return of Creature. This time he was holding a small lavender address book in his hands. "Mistress Jenny said to give this to you," he said, handing the book to Harry. Harry's eyes lit up in recognition and smiled warmly while he took the book with his free hand. "Thank her for me, please, Creature." "That was very thoughtful of her." Creature nodded, his head up and down, his long ears flapping and his eyes shining. "Then could you let Ron and Hermione know everything is okay? They should be waiting at my house." With a nod of his head and another loud crack, Creature vanished. "Holly," began Harry cheerfully as they walked into the infirmary, "I think your very worried parents would like to hear from you." Not knowing what else to do, Dylan and Laurel sat on the bed and waited, staring at that ever-so-dark pendant. Occasionally Dylan would look at the clock and watch the minutes tick by, but mostly he stared at the pendant. Laurel alternated her looks between the pendant and the address book, as if willing it to light up. After a while, Laurel got up and made a pot of tea, pouring out the cup of hot liquid for each of them to drink. The steaming cups cooled with their contents untouched. Neither one of them felt like drinking. Around 12:30 a.m., the color of the pendant lightened considerably. What did that mean? Neither of them knew, but felt heartened by the color change. Around 1 a.m., the purple light on the address book lit up. Laurel grabbed the covers and opened the book. "Holly is fine. I don't know the details, but she's being taken to the infirmary." And like that, the weight of the universe lifted. Dylan and Laurel hugged each other, sobbing in relief. They didn't know what had happened, didn't really care. There would be time for questions later. Suddenly, they both felt very, very tired. Laurel put the address book on the dresser and they both changed quickly for bed. "Look," said Dylan as he was turning out the lights. The light on the address book was lit again. Dylan left the lights on and instead reached for the book. He opened it. "Hi, Mom and Dad. I'm fine. Everything's okay. Love, Holly." "It's Holly. She's written us." Laurel looked over Dylan's shoulder and read the message too. "Where's your pen?" asked Dylan in a shaky voice. He found the pen and scribbled a message in the book, quickly before he thought about what he was doing. "Are you really okay?" Dylan shut the book, as he had seen Laurel do. Then he stared at the book, waiting for it to light up, as it had done before. A few minutes later, the purple chip lit up. Dylan opened the book. "Is that really you, Daddy? I'm so happy. Yes, I am fine. I just have a sprained ankle and some cuts and bruises. It's nothing, really. I can't wait to see you again. I have so much to tell you. I've got to go now. They're calling me. I miss you and Mum so much. Love, Holly. Dylan stared at the message a long time. Finally, he scribbled his own message beneath it. We love you too, baby. And shut the book. Harry had always come back from Hogwarts changed. Holly would be changed too. But maybe not in ways that were important. A while later, everyone was seated comfortably about Albus's bed. The children had been cleaned, cuts and bruises healed. Harry Potter sat next to Albus. Albus clung tightly to Harry's hand, refusing to let go even now. Neville and McGonagall pulled up chairs nearby, while Luna sat cross-legged on a neighboring bed. The yellow eyes on her lavender robe blinked sleepily. Her hair hung straight. All 3 butterfly clips fluttered in the air, seeking new places to land. Next to Luna on the bed sat Holly. Holly had refused to lie down in the bed. In Holly's lap curled one very happy cat. Sasha appeared at the infirmary soon after Madame Pomfrey had begun her examination of Holly. The cat had streaked through the infirmary doors like a gray rocket on fire, and landed on Holly's lap, digging her claws in, refusing to leave. No doubt Becky or someone had let Sasha out of the dorms as soon as they received word that Holly had been found. Holly's delight at Sasha's presence was unmistakable. Then Madame Pomfrey insisted Sasha be returned to the dorms, as Holly was still supposed to be learning to block. "But I can block now," protested Holly. "So, can she stay?" "You can," said Madame Pomfrey, raising an eyebrow with a look that said she would talk about this later with Holly. "Uh-huh," Holly replied. "Albus helped me." Said Madame Pomfrey, non-committally, while she rubbed ointment in Holly's cuts, making them heal quickly. "So, tell me, what is wrong with Albus?" "A bunch of broken ribs," replied Holly promptly. "But they're healing now, and his arms and legs are still a bit tingly, so I think he needs something to improve blood circulation." "Anything else?" "Well, his throat is scratchy and he's pretty thirsty," added Holly absently, more interested in her cat. "So, can Sasha stay, can't she?" "What about you?" continued Madame Pomfrey, ignoring Holly's question. "Me? Oh, I just have that bump on my head and a sprained ankle," replied Holly. "It's nothing, really." "Please?" Holly begged. "The cat?" "Well, I suppose for tonight," said Madame Pomfrey grudgingly. "But after that, we'll see." "Thanks," said Holly with a smile, and she buried her face in the loudly purring cat, while Madame Pomfrey examined and treated her swollen ankle. Ginny arrived at the infirmary and gave both Albus and Holly a tearful welcome. Knowing the events of the evening somehow involved Tom Riddle, and Ginny's first year at Hogwarts, Headmistress McGonagall permitted her to remain to hear Albus's tale. White-faced, Ginny sat down next to Harry. "Well," began Albus, "I didn't mean to touch the heart, but I just couldn't stop myself." Both Harry and Holly nodded, knowing the compulsion they had felt around the heart. Harry squeezed Albus's hand reassuringly. "And then suddenly everything went all dark, and I was someplace else. My wand wouldn't work, and I couldn't see anything. So I put my wand away and tried to feel around to see if I could figure out where I was. I bumped into something hard, and the next thing I knew, I was being pulled into this chair. I tried, but I couldn't get out. I couldn't even get to my wand." Albus stopped. His face looked panic-stricken as he remembered that chair. "It's okay," said Luna soothingly. "It's all over now. You're okay." "Go on, Albus," encouraged Harry softly. "I know this is hard, but you'll feel better afterwards. I guarantee it." "Well, then the lights came on, and this guy in wizard robes appeared in front of me. Black hair, black eyes, and a really cold voice." "Tom Riddle," whispered Harry, chilled by the thought of his return. Albus nodded. "That's what Holly said, too, but I didn't know that then. The man said, 'Hello, Harry Potter. Surprised to see me?'" "No," whispered McGonagall. "Go on," encouraged Luna softly. "Well, I tried to tell him I wasn't Harry Potter, but he just kept on talking, saying stuff about a rematch and how Mum, Ginny clutched the arms of the chair tighter and held herself stiffly erect at his words, and he had fixed it so that I, meaning Dad, was going to die this time. I don't remember any of this, whispered Ginny, her face white and her eyes wide. This was not your mother's doing, Albus, assured Harry firmly. Tom Riddle enchanted a diary that was given to your mother, Harry explained. The diary bewitched your mum and forced her to do all sorts of things that year, things she never remembered afterwards. Why didn't we hear about this? Asked Neville. I was ashamed, whispered Ginny, and so afraid of being expelled. Even with a diary as proof, people might have believed I did all those things on my own. Dumbledore and McGonagall knew the truth, added Harry quietly, and as we knew the Chamber of Secrets would bother no one again, we never mentioned Ginny's involvement. What happened next? Asked McGonagall. Well, continued Albus, the guy talked about some help you would need that would come to me in the chair instead of you out there. And the next thing I knew, he had vanished, and there was this huge mirror thing in front of me. Holly reached over, poured a glass of water, and handed it to Albus. Thanks, he said briefly, and took a drink. In the mirror, he continued, I could see this huge cavern. You were there, Dad, and Mum, and this Riddle guy. Mum, you were on the ground. I thought you were dead. Ginny nodded. The Chamber of Secrets, she whispered. Her face was very pale. And Dad, continued Albus, you were talking to Riddle, but I couldn't hear any of the words. All of a sudden you started running, and there was this huge basilisk chasing after you. Harry also nodded, his face pale, remembering. And then the sword. Albus choked on the words. It's okay, soothed Luna. Everything's okay now. Harry again squeezed Albus's hand reassuringly. What happened next? He asked encouragingly. Albus took another gulp of water and set the glass down on the side table before continuing. This sword appeared on the floor in front of me, he began, and the basilisk got you in his mouth, and he bit down and kind of shook you. Albus broke off and rubbed his eyes, clearly trying to keep from crying. Then the room got all dark again, he whispered, and I had this awful feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I felt all lightheaded like I didn't belong. I knew I was going to die alone in that room, but I didn't care, because there was no reason to live. I'd killed you, Dad, and I didn't want to live. It was horrible. It didn't happen that way, corrected Harry quietly in the silence that followed. I got the sword of Gryffindor and used it to kill the snake. I'm not dead, he assured Albus, squeezing his hand again tightly, and you haven't killed me. Albus looked up at Harry, clearly reassured by his presence. How did you get out? Asked McGonagall, changing the subject. Albus gulped some more water before speaking. Holly walked in, he said simply. Everyone looked over at Holly, who was sitting quietly stroking Sasha. Holly looked up around the room and realized they were expecting her to say something. She began. I saw the heart and just had to touch it. She stopped speaking and looked back at Albus. It was his story to tell. I was so upset about Dad, I didn't realize she was there at first, admitted Albus. But when she bumped into the chair, I screamed at her to get away, and she managed to not get caught by the chair. I think that was partly because I was already in it. Then the lights came on again, and Tom Riddle appeared again, and when he started saying the same words over, I realized maybe we had a chance to fix things. Albus stopped to take another sip of water. Then he continued. Sure enough, the mirror showed the same scene with Dad, Mum, and Tom Riddle, and the basilisk came after Dad again. And when the sword appeared, Holly got it into the mirror. Into the sorting hat, murmured Holly. You grabbed the sword and killed the basilisk. Albus finished looking at Harry. Harry nodded, his face lost in the recollection. What happened next? asked Neville. Well, the room got all dark again. After a few minutes, the light came on, and the mirror showed us the outside of Hogwarts Castle. Lord Voldemort, finished Holly quietly. Yeah, agreed Albus. Well, he was in front of this procession, and Hagrid was carrying you, Dad. You look dead. But Holly said it must be some sort of a trick, or we wouldn't be able to see you in the mirror. It was, agreed Harry quietly. Well, everyone in the castle came out, and you, Albus said, looking at Professor Longbottom, came out and stood in front. And the sorting hat went on your head and started burning. That sword appeared again, and Holly got it into the mirror. In the sorting hat again, added Holly softly, still stroking her cat. And you pulled out the sword and chopped off the head of the snake sitting on Lord Voldemort's shoulder. I never expected that, finished Albus. Me neither, agreed Holly. I didn't think I could do it, admitted Neville, his face lost in his own memories. But Harry said I had to get the snake, so I tried. Headmistress McGonagall looked from Neville to Harry for further explanation, but none was forthcoming. Well, the snake's head went spinning in the air right at us, Holly added, and when it seemed to touch the mirror exploded. That's when we got all these cuts and bruises, she explained. And after that, the lights went out again, said Albus. And I think Holly was knocked unconscious. I waited forever for her to wake up. When she did, she used her wand to get me out of the chair, and we both went over to the wall where we had entered and tried to blast our way out. The room was falling apart, added Holly, and we weren't sure that blasting would do any good. We were sure glad you were waiting for us on the other side. As am I, said Harry, remembering the empty hole where the room had once been. Had they not been there in time to get them out the rest of the way? Have you anything else to add, Holly? He asked, changing the subject. No, she replied. Everyone but Albus looked at Holly in surprise, but no one said anything. Albus seemed content with Holly's answer. Where did you get your wand? Asked Luna casually. Holly shrugged. I sort of found it, she mumbled, not adding any details. Holly knew the adults were looking at her strangely again, but she was determined to not say any more. I'm kind of tired, Albus commented in the silence that followed, and he yawned. Speaking of tired, added Luna, I have to teach tomorrow. If you will excuse me, I think I'll try to get some sleep before class. She got up off the bed. I'm glad everything turned out all right, she said as she collected her 3 butterfly clips, one perched in Holly's hair, one in Sasha's fur, and the last one was clipping up the bedsheet. Happy endings are so much nicer. I need to get some rest too, added Neville, rising also. It's been a long night. The 2 professors exited. Harry Potter slipped his hand from Albus's grasp. Turning to McGonagall, he asked quietly, Would you mind if Holly and I had a word together? McGonagall nodded her consent. Holly, said Harry, standing and reaching for Holly's hand, would you walk with me, please? Ginny took over Harry's chair and took Albus's hand in hers. Holly obediently slipped off the bed. Sasha jumped onto her shoulder. Harry moved away from the beds, and Holly followed. The 2 walked down to the end of the infirmary, where they could speak in private. There was a large window at the end of the infirmary. Harry and Holly stood at the window looking out at the starry sky and the ground below. You vanished from your bed from a secure dorm without a trace, said Harry without emotion. I am sure the story of how you got from there to the trophy room is no less interesting than the tale Albus told. Holly said nothing. Harry pondered the possible reasons for her silence. Is it perhaps something you did not wish to say in front of Albus? Holly nodded slowly. Then she said, He was so devastated when he thought you were dead. When I came into that room, I became so sad I wanted to kill myself. Even now, the very thought of what he might have done. Holly broke off. If Albus knew what really happened, she continued in a rush, it was more than a mirror showing pictures. Harry listened to her words without comment. He gazed out at the stars while thinking about what Holly had said. Finally, he spoke. "May I see your wand?" Slowly, Holly drew out the wand from her pocket and handed it to Harry. Harry held the wand carefully and examined it in the starlight. It felt oddly familiar, but it was not the wand she had gotten at Ollivander's. He wondered about that when Luna had asked the question. Harry considered the wand thoughtfully. "Hagrid told me about the problems Miss Smith had with her wand," began Harry, turning the wand over in his hand, "and how they had to make a special trip to Ollivander's to get another wand." Holly said nothing. She just stared intently out the window. "It would be most unusual," continued Harry calmly, "to find a wand just lying around for use, especially a wand that works so well for a first-year student. Where did you get the wand?" Holly was silent for so long that Harry was afraid she wouldn't answer. Finally she spoke in a low voice. "Headmaster Snape gave it to me." Harry broke off. Snape was dead. How could he have given her anything? Harry considered the ramifications of her words. What had happened to her while Albus was in that room? "Is this his wand?" he asked, looking at it again, forcing himself to accept her words as truth. "No, sir," replied Holly in that same low voice. Then she added in a whisper, "It's your mum, Lily's." Lily's? That would explain the familiar feel. But Lily's? Given to Holly by Snape? Was it possible? "Did you hear what Tom Riddle said to Albus?" "Yes, sir," replied Holly in a small voice. "What exactly did he say?" "He said something about turning time backwards and fixing it so you could watch yourself die," came the answer. Turning time? Was it possible? Of course it was possible. He and Hermione had turned back time the very next year to save Sirius. Could Tom Riddle have found a way to turn time? Dumbledore described Tom Riddle as an unusually talented student with powers that were surprisingly well developed. So perhaps he had. Would Riddle turn back time? Why not? Unlike Voldemort, the Riddle from the diary had no soul to split. Turning back time would have been a way to ensure his continued existence. Had Riddle done it? Harry turned Lily's wand over in his hand. It would seem he had. How else would Holly have met Snape and gotten this wand? That mirror was more than just a scary window showing the past, wasn't it? Harry stated quietly. Holly nodded silently. Tears were streaming down her eyes. "It was the past," concluded Harry softly. "And I actually did die, didn't I?" "Headmaster Snape said that Harry Potter vanished along with the 2 Weasley students after the Chamber of Secrets opened." Holly's voice trembled as she spoke. "And they were never found." Harry stared blankly out the window. If Riddle's spell hadn't rewound time once again when Holly entered the chamber, he would be a distant memory. Harry shivered. "You say Headmaster Snape gave you this wand?" asked Harry finally as he handed the wand back to Holly. "Yes, sir," replied Holly, tucking the wand back into her pocket. "Do you know why?" "He said he thought I might need it." "I'm guessing, but you only met briefly. Am I correct?" asked Harry. Holly nodded slowly. "Do you know why he decided to help you?" "I think so, sir," said Holly softly, watching the stars twinkle outside. "He loved your mum very much." "That is a secret Headmaster Snape shared with only one other person," replied Harry quietly. "Albus Dumbledore. And Dumbledore told no one." Harry looked down at Holly, who stared resolutely out the window. He sighed. I have no doubt that you have had one terrifying day which you would rather forget, Harry began gently. But I think you should tell your story and not keep it bottled up. You'll feel better afterwards, he assured Holly. I know. Harry paused a moment, letting Holly think about it. Then he added, There is another reason why I want you to tell your story. It is because you have met Headmaster Severus Snape. Holly looked up at Harry in surprise. Now it was Harry's turn to look out the window, finding it difficult to meet Holly's eyes. Severus Snape, began Harry, was one of the supporters of Lord Voldemort, until Lily died. Then he swore to protect me, for Lily's sake. This was a dangerous task. He worked in secret, publicly opposing Voldemort, privately pretending to support Voldemort, and all the while giving Dumbledore information on Voldemort's activities. Professor Snape, for he was one of my professors at Hogwarts at the time, Professor Snape and I did not get along at all. You see, confessed Harry, though I have Lily's eyes, the rest of me looks like my father, James. Dad was a bit of a bully towards Severus Snape during their school days. When Snape saw me, he saw only the bully he hated. But he kept his word, and he did everything he could to help protect me from Voldemort. Even with his dying breath, he was doing what he could to help me. For Lily's sake, murmured Holly. Yes, for Lily's sake, agreed Harry soberly. I never knew. I was convinced that Snape was actually working for Voldemort despite Dumbledore's assurances to the contrary. It was only after Snape's death that I found out what he had done, what he had risked to help me, finished Harry softly. Then he added, and I never had a chance to apologize or say thank you. The two stood silently for a while, watching the world outside. Then Harry said quietly, I want Albus to hear your story too. I understand your concerns, he added quickly when Holly started to protest. Albus did not set that trap or cause my death. Tom Riddle did. Albus will figure that out eventually. It is more important that he hears about Headmaster Snape. Harry took a deep breath. This was painful for him to say. I didn't like Severus Snape, he said softly. One of the bravest men I ever knew. He risked everything for me, and I didn't like him. None of us did. Snape played his part too well. I can't tell Albus anything about the man who did so much for us, because all my memories of him are so hateful. You can give him a different picture. You can tell us both about the man Headmaster Snape really was. Will you do that? Slowly, Holly nodded. She put her hand in Harry's, and the two walked back to the beds. Albus was fast asleep, with Ginny sitting beside him. McGonagall also sat nearby quietly, awaiting their return. Holly climbed up on her bed again, Sasha curled up on her lap. Harry reached out and shook Albus gently. Albus, wake up. Albus stirred. Can't it wait? Protested Ginny. He's so tired. I don't think so. No, replied Harry. We need to do this now. He continued to shake Albus. Albus, wake up. It's important. Albus opened his eyes sleepily. He gave a start and then saw Harry and relaxed. Oh, Dad, you're here, he smiled. I had this horrible dream where I was trapped and you were dead. No, Albus, corrected Harry gently. It wasn't a dream. It was a terrible nightmare, and it was all very, very real. Albus's eyes widened in fear. He was wide awake again. All his previous terror returned. You need to listen to Holly's story, Harry continued softly, while ignoring Albus's reaction. Albus looked over at Holly sitting on the other bed, her head bent, stroking her cat. Her story ends when she stepped into that room with you. It begins, I think, at the moment you saw that basilisk kill me. Everyone looked at Holly. Holly lifted her head and stared at a blank place on a curtain, looking at no one. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was soft but clear. Her lips trembled a bit. I woke up this morning when I fell off my bed. When Holly finished, tears were streaming down Albus's face. But they were not tears for the father he thought he'd killed, but for the man who had knowingly given up everything that they might live. An actual time reverse curse? Said McGonagall quietly to Harry after Ginny had again tucked Albus into bed. Holly had consented to lie down in her bed. The covers were pulled up, but her eyes were wide open, watching, and she continually stroked her cat, which lay stretched out at Holly's side. I've only read about such things as speculation. I've never heard of it actually being done. But then how could I? It should have been undetectable. McGonagall glanced over at Holly. How do you suppose she escaped its effect? Dumbledore, replied Harry promptly. If anyone could have done it, it had to be Dumbledore. Dumbledore? But he's dead. I know, said Harry with frustration. But he wasn't dead when Ginny got that diary, reminded Harry. And can you think of anyone else powerful enough to have done something like this? McGonagall shook her head. No one could have cast a protective spell after Riddle's curse was enacted, reasoned Harry with more confidence. This really wasn't his field of expertise, but he was fairly certain Holly's parents would have never met if Harry, had died. Harry took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts, and then continued. My friends cast all sorts of spells surrounding my family, Holly's father and grandparents, to protect them when they went into hiding, he began cautiously. Doesn't it make sense that Dumbledore did the same when I first went there to live with him? He was rewarded by a slow nod from McGonagall. Encouraged, Harry continued. Those protective spells were there before Riddle cast his curse, and they must have been strong enough to withstand and protect the family from Riddle's spell. But that was over 20 years ago, protested McGonagall, and Holly wasn't even born then. Harry took off his glasses and wiped an imaginary speck of dust off a lens. Maybe Dumbledore's spells protected the whole family, not individuals, Harry said speculatively. The spells would have been easier and faster to cast that way, don't you think? My aunt and uncle might have decided to have more than one child. A family kind of spell would have included any future children, so Dumbledore wouldn't have to return to cast more spells. Perhaps, agreed McGonagall thoughtfully, but Holly isn't a second or third child. True, admitted Harry, but she is directly related to my aunt and uncle by blood. That makes Holly part of the family. The spells Dumbledore cast must have somehow protected her as well. Otherwise, Harry's voice trailed off, unwilling to verbalize what might have happened. It's only a guess, of course, Harry finished, putting his now spotless glasses back on. Have you a better idea? No, admitted McGonagall, and in all honesty, I don't suppose it matters, not now. But a time reverse curse? She exclaimed with indignation. How could Riddle dare? How could he have done such a thing? I can't say I'm really surprised, commented Harry dryly. The Voldemort I knew wanted immortality. The desire was probably there in his youth as well. Tom Riddle enchanted that diary with his 16-year-old personality. Of course the riddle in the diary tried to guarantee its own immortality as well. And if Holly hadn't been protected as she was, Harry stopped. The alternative was too much to contemplate. We've been very lucky tonight, he concluded simply. We have indeed, agreed McGonagall grimly. She looked at Harry. Are you ever going to tell me what Voldemort was up to, what you did that last year and the thing you had to find? It's been almost 20 years. I know, but no, I won't, replied Harry calmly. Believe it or not, what Voldemort did was just as bad, if not worse, than Tom Riddle's plan. Let it die with him. McGonagall nodded. She hadn't expected Harry to explain. He hadn't in 20 years, but it never hurt to ask. She looked over at Holly. Harry followed her glance. The girl hastily closed her eyes, feigning sleep. Why do you suppose he did it, helping her like that? McGonagall asked, changing the subject. Who? Headmaster Snape? McGonagall nodded. Holly had left out the parts about Lily in her narrative, saying only that Snape noted her resemblance to Lily and realized she must be related to Harry. Nor had Holly said whose wand she had received from Snape. Lily had been Snape's secret, Even with him dead, Holly would not reveal it. Harry had not objected to her decision. It was the one thing Snape had never wanted anyone to know. "Maybe Dumbledore was right when he said Snape regretted his earlier support of Voldemort," replied Harry finally. "He saw a chance to remove Voldemort and took it." "Humph," snorted McGonagall. "I think there may be more to Snape than meets the eye. Maybe I should have a long talk with his portrait one of these days." "Do that," encouraged Harry. "Snape has probably done much more than we give him credit for. About Richards," he continued, changing the subject, "I hope you're not going to expel him." "I haven't made up my mind about Richards, as if it were any of your business," replied McGonagall tartly. "Of course not," agreed Harry smoothly. "But as a parent of a student affected by his actions, I am certainly interested in what happens to Richards, and as a Hogwarts governor, the interest of all the students at Hogwarts is my business." "What he has done is reprehensible, doing that to a Daniels. Albus and Holly could have died," stated McGonagall vehemently. "We cannot tolerate behavior like that." "Agreed," said Harry, "and I hope you make that very clear to him. But no one did die. There are no finer professors than at Hogwarts. If Richards is expelled, whom will he turn to for instruction? Richards cannot learn from his mistakes if he is not given a second chance." McGonagall stared at Harry. "You constantly amaze me, Potter," she said finally. "I will consider your words." "Thank you," said Harry quietly. He looked down at Albus, now sound asleep, with Ginny still holding his hand. Then he looked over at Holly, who lay tense in her bed with her eyes again wide open. She'd clearly given up trying to sleep. "May we spend the night?" he asked softly. McGonagall followed Harry's glance at Holly, noting she was still awake. "Of course," she replied. "There isn't much of a night left anyway. It would be foolish to expect you to leave now." "Thank you," said Harry. "Well, I've got to get going," said McGonagall. "Perhaps I can get in a couple hours of rest before tomorrow. Good night, Potter, Mrs. Potter," she said to each of them, and quietly left the infirmary. Harry looked again at Holly, whose eyes were still wide open. "Aren't you going to sleep?" he asked her. "I'm not sleepy," replied Holly. "Oh. Well, perhaps you would like to watch the sunrise with me." Holly nodded. She got out of bed and followed Harry back to the window. Sasha trailed along. Harry pulled up one of the chairs. Using his wand, he transformed it into a large, cushy armchair. He pulled one of the end tables over and transformed it into a footstool. "Do you think this chair is large enough for two?" he asked, sitting down and resting his legs on the footstool. "Or are you too big to sit on laps now?" In response, Holly sat down on Harry's lap and curled up in the chair with him. Sasha jumped onto Holly's lap and curled up as well. Harry wrapped an arm around Holly. "I expect it was pretty frightening to go to sleep in one place and wake up somewhere totally different," he said. Holly nodded silently. "In fact," he continued thoughtfully, "one might be even afraid to go to sleep for fear it would happen again." Holly didn't speak. "I don't really think you have anything to fear, though," continued Harry casually. "You broke the spell, and Riddle isn't around to make a new one. Even if he were, I'm sure you'd be able to do it again." "I was just lucky," Holly mumbled. "We all were," agreed Harry. Using his free hand, he aimed his wand back to the beds. "Accio," he commanded, and a thick blanket floated up and landed in his waiting hand. Harry wrapped the blanket around them both, covering Sasha as well. "That's a nice spell," murmured Holly. "It's very useful," agreed Harry. "I learned it during my 4th year at Hogwarts. Did anyone ever tell you about how I faced a dragon to get an egg during the Tri-Wizard competition?" "No, sir." So Harry told Holly about his experiences with the dragon, and then he talked about his first Quidditch match, and continued to talk about anything and everything, as long as it didn't have to do with Tom Riddle or Lord Voldemort. As he talked, the early morning grays brightened to daylight until the sun shone all around. Sometime during the morning, well after the sun had risen, Holly eventually drifted off to sleep. But Harry continued to hold her. He didn't want Holly to wake up afraid again. He would hold her all day if necessary. It was the least he could do for her. He owed Holly so much. They all did.